Next up, let's talk about buttons. So buttons are pretty important to your typical web page, whether they're in a form, which is super common, right? We've got a button here to create an account, a PayPal button, a Google button, an email button. Those are all buttons. But also, we often will just have buttons that don't necessarily exist inside of some form. This login button, a sign up button, join, these may actually be links masquerading as buttons thanks to CSS, but it's pretty common to have buttons, right? Up arrow, down arrow, those are all some form of a button, or they look like a button at least. So there's an element, surprise, surprise, called button. And button has an opening and closing tag, and whatever text we put inside of it will be used to label the button. And just like all of these other inputs that we've seen, these different form controls, each browser has some default styling, but you can change that. So the button that you're going to see right now is not the permanent button that you'll be stuck with. You can change it once we get to CSS. So why don't we add a button at the end of the form that says, submit or something. That's all we need. Button, closing tag, and then some text inside. Refresh, and there's my button. It says submit. Okay, so now let's talk about what this button does. If I click this button, what's going to happen here? Oh, what happened? It took me to /tacos. Why am I at /tacos? Well, that is the action of my form, and /tacos just does not exist at the moment. It's not being found. File was not found. It's looking for a file called /tacos. It doesn't exist, but it's taking me there. It's sending a request because I am submitting the form. When I have a button in a form and I don't explicitly say this should not submit the form, it is going to submit the form. So I could make a couple of buttons. I'll put one up here and it says, please do not submit the form. I'll put one in the middle. Submit, how about I'll just say in the middle. So I've got 3 different buttons. One has the text of submit and it submits the form. One says, please do not submit. It also submits the form. And then the middle one says in the middle and it submits the form. Now, if I move these outside of a form, or if I just make a button up top, outside form, if I can spell correctly, outside form, this is not in the form, it does nothing. I can use JavaScript to make it do something once we get there, but at the moment, it's not submitting a form, it doesn't do anything. So if you have a button inside of a form, the default behavior will be to submit that form. But we have an option. We can pass in an attribute called type, just like the type attribute for input, but we have different options or different values. So what I can do is set type equal to button. And this tells the browser, I want this button to behave just like a button. I don't want it to be a submit button, but just a regular old button that won't do anything. So I'm clicking it and it no longer submits the form. The default when a button is inside of a form is for it to submit. So if I change it back to that, it submits the form. Or I could just leave it off. But if you want a button inside of a form that does not actually submit the form, you can set its type to button. But that's not that common, at least not until we get to JavaScript. There are times you may want this. Okay, so that is one option. One other thing that you will see sometimes, although I'm not a big fan of it, is an input with the type of submit. And this is kind of it's not a bad way at all, but it's an odder way to make a submit button like we have here. Just going to comment that button out. You'll see we have 2 buttons and they both look identical, at least right now they do. This one came from the input type submit. This one came from button. And the reason I don't like this is that it's an input, which means there's no closing tag. And if I want to change that text on the regular button, I could change it very easily. I can add 3 exclamation points. It's right there. With this input, I didn't decide on this text, but I can change it. I just have to use an attribute called value, and I could do something like click me. But it's an attribute this time instead of quotes, and it's just a little clunkier, but it does work. So that's another option. I'll go ahead and write up some comments here so you can see the different types. All right, so I added some comments. We've got this button with type of button. It won't submit even though it's in the form. We've got this button with no type, but the default is to submit the form when it's inside of a form. And then we have input type equals submit. It also submits the form, but I don't like the syntax as much. And then lastly, I added a button outside of the form just to show you that there's no default behavior. it's acting just like a regular type equals button, not type equals submit. It won't submit any form. It does nothing. Okay, so that's buttons. Obviously very important to be able to submit a form. So next up, we're going to talk a bit more about what happens when we do submit. What's happening here and where's our data going?